Eli Dawson spent years mocked as the thin drifter, humiliated in front of his entire town. Cal Harper, the arrogant son of a wealthy farmer, pushed the cruelty further, daring him to attempt the impossible just to break him. But Eli had a hidden strength, and 1 mile under a crushing burden turned every jeer into stunned silence. And just wait until you hear how this moment of defiance transformed him into a legend, proving that true strength can outshine any injustice. In the quiet town of Riverstone, surrounded by endless cornfields in Iowa, there lived a young man named Eli Dawson. He was tall but strikingly thin, with narrow shoulders and a posture that gave the impression of someone trying to fold into himself, as if to occupy less space in a world that often ignored him. The people of Riverstone noticed him, but not with kindness. To them, Eli was a figure to whisper about, a subject for idle talk when the days grew long and the bar filled with tired farmers. They would laugh quietly to one another, saying things like, "One strong breeze, and he'll be blown clear across the fields." These words were not meant to be cruel in their own eyes, only jokes tossed into the air. But repeated often enough, they carved into Eli's image like marks on wood. Even children, who learned from watching the adults, would run past him on the dirt roads and throw careless remarks his way. They never stopped to wonder what weight their words carried, how heavy they might be on someone who already looked worn down by life. Eli never responded. He would simply press his lips together in that faint, unshakable smile that seemed both humble and resigned, then continue on his way. He moved through Riverstone like a shadow, visible but never fully acknowledged, a presence too fragile to be taken seriously. To the people around him, he was the thin drifter who wandered aimlessly, someone who would never make a mark. Yet what they could not see, what no one had ever stopped to imagine, was that behind those weary eyes and beneath the fragile frame lived a story heavier than any insult they could throw. His silence was not weakness, and his smile was not surrender. There was a will inside him, deep and unyielding, built from years of carrying burdens invisible to others. Life in Riverstone was slow, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's history, but somehow Eli's past remained untold. He did not boast, he did not complain, and he never demanded attention. People mistook that silence for emptiness, assuming he was a man without drive, without fire. They believed his slight body reflected a slight soul. But they were wrong. His will had been tested quietly in ways they had never witnessed. He endured long days and harder nights, responsibilities that would have bent stronger men. He carried it all with the same quiet dignity he showed when the world mocked him. To the town, Eli Dawson was a joke, a name that sparked laughter and shrugs. But what they failed to understand was that appearances can be the greatest illusion. For while Riverstone saw a man who could be blown away by the wind, Eli carried within him a force that the town would one day see with their own eyes. It would take a moment, a challenge, something extraordinary to strip away the veil of doubt and reveal the strength hidden in his fragile frame. Until then, he walked those dusty roads, meeting cruelty with silence, holding inside a resolve no one could have guessed. The men of Riverstone had their own kind of entertainment, and too often, Eli Dawson was at the center of it. He never asked for attention, never provoked anyone. Yet the way he carried himself, quiet, lean, seemingly fragile, made him an easy target. And no one took greater pleasure in mocking him than Cal Harper. Cal was the son of one of the wealthiest hog farmers in the county, a man who had grown up never knowing the taste of hunger or the weight of real struggle. Broad-shouldered and thick-armed, Cal was built like the barns he worked in, solid, unshakable, with fists as heavy as iron tools. His very presence in a room drew glances, and he basked in it. To him, respect came as naturally as breathing, and so he believed he had the right to belittle those who did not share his strength. The town bar was where Cal thrived most. The wooden floors were stained with years of spilled drinks, the air heavy with smoke and laughter, the kind of place where a man's pride could be broken or lifted depending on who held the room's attention. On that particular evening, Eli had slipped in quietly, taking a seat in the corner, his eyes lowered, his movements careful. He ordered a simple glass of beer, no boast, no noise. To anyone else, he was nearly invisible. But to Cal, his very invisibility was an invitation. Cal swaggered across the floor, his boots hitting the wood with the sound of someone announcing their arrival. He had a group of men behind him, all eager to laugh at whatever joke he decided to make. And then, with deliberate timing, Cal shouldered past Eli, knocking into him with a force that sent the glass tipping. Amber liquid splashed across the table, dripping onto the floor. The bar erupted in laughter as though the moment had been rehearsed. "Look at this," Cal roared, his voice booming over the din. "Our skeleton friend's got himself a drink and now he's watered the floor. Careful, Eli, don't drown in it." The men howled, slapping the tables. One of them added mockingly, "Give him a straw, Cal." Might be too heavy for him to lift again. The cruel words stung sharper than the spill itself, because they echoed what Eli had heard for years, thrown at him like stones. He didn't flinch, didn't argue. With the same calm expression, he reached for a rag and began to wipe the table clean. The smile he offered was small, almost invisible, as if to say he had no fight in him. To the crowd, this was proof of weakness, the kind of response that fed Cal's pride and the laughter of the others. But beneath that stillness, something was shifting. Eli had long learned how to endure, how to let the jeers roll over him without leaving a visible mark, yet endurance has its cost. With every careless insult, every laugh at his expense, the wound grew deeper. That night, as the bar echoed with Cal's booming laughter and the mocking words of the crowd, Eli felt a heat rise within him. It was not the fire of anger that lashes out, but something slower, more enduring, like embers buried deep that waited for air to ignite. He finished wiping the table, set the rag aside, and rose to leave without saying a word. To those in the bar, it was another victory for Cal Harper. Another night where the town's strongest had humiliated the weakest. But as Eli stepped into the cool night air, the noise of laughter fading behind him, his chest was heavy with something he could no longer ignore. He was not blind to their cruelty. He was not deaf to their words. He had endured because he had reasons no one in that bar would ever understand. Yet even a quiet man has a breaking point, and though Eli's had not come that night, the cracks were beginning to show. In Riverstone, the pattern had become routine. Cal's cruelty, the crowd's laughter, and Eli's silence. But routine is fragile, and sooner or later one moment would come that shattered the order they all thought unshakable. Eli felt it in his chest that night, a weight pressing against the calm he wore like armor. They believed him too weak to resist, too insignificant to matter. They could not see that with every word, every shove, every laugh, they were not breaking him. They were forging him. Dot. On the far edge of Riverstone, where the paved roads turned to gravel and the street lamps gave way to fields of shadow, stood a small, weathered house that belonged to Eli Dawson. It was the kind of place most people passed without a second glance, its paint faded, its porch boards creaking under the weight of time. To the town, it was simply the modest home of the thin drifter, but inside it lived the truth of why Eli endured so much in silence. That house was not just his refuge. It was a place of duty, of love, and of burdens too heavy for most to imagine. Eli's life after sundown was a story no one in the bar or on the streets ever bothered to know. When the laughter of the town faded into the night, he would walk home through the quiet, his steps measured, his mind already on the tasks waiting for him. The fences around the property often needed repair, boards sagging and posts leaning, and Eli would take to them with steady patience. His hands, though not broad like Cal Harper's, were strong in their own way, calloused from tools, marked by effort that no one ever applauded. When neighbors found their gates broken or water troughs empty, Eli would appear, unasked, to mend what was needed. He carried buckets of water for cattle, split wood for stoves, and tightened hinges on doors that would have fallen from their frames. He asked for nothing in return. To those who saw him briefly at work, it looked like odd jobs, a man filling his evenings with chores. But to Eli, these were the moments when he could give, when he could serve, because in his own home, another responsibility anchored his every breath. Inside, in a small room filled with the scent of clean linen and the faint light of a lamp, lay his younger sister, Lily. Once lively and bright, Lily's world had been stilled by an accident that left her unable to walk. Her smile had not faded, but her life had been narrowed to the walls of that little house. Eli had taken it upon himself to be her arms, her legs, her shield against the world. He cooked for her, lifted her gently when she needed to move, read aloud from the books she loved, and sat by her window when nights were long. Every decision he made, every ounce of restraint he showed in town was tied to her well-being. He could not afford recklessness. He could not afford the bruises and broken pride that came from fighting men like Cal Harper. A single injury might mean he could not care for her properly, and that was a risk he would never take. This was the truth behind his quiet smile, the reason he walked away from insults without protest. The men who mocked him thought him weak, a coward, unwilling to defend his own dignity. They saw a thin figure and mistook restraint for fear. But what they could not understand was that Eli's strength was not measured in fists or in public defiance. His strength lived in sacrifice. He bore their ridicule because his sister needed him whole. Each cruel word that others tossed aside without thought cut into him. Yet he endured because there was someone at home who depended on his endurance. That hidden reality gave meaning to his silence. Many in Riverstone would never have guessed that the same man they laughed at every evening spent his nights lifting far heavier burdens than they could see. They could not know what it was to feed another before feeding yourself, to measure every action by the question of whether it might harm the one person you loved most. Eli carried all of this without complaint because for him, love was stronger than pride. He could live with their mockery, but he could not live with failing Lily. The irony was cruel. The very thing that made him seem powerless in the eyes of the town was the thing that gave him more strength than any of them could claim. Each day of silence was not surrender, but discipline. Each refusal to fight was not weakness, but choice. And though the people of Riverstone saw only a man too frail to stand up for himself, the truth was that Eli Dawson stood taller in his quiet devotion than any of them knew. The Riverstone Fair reached its loudest hour when the sun hovered just above the courthouse roof and turned the square the color of warm brass. Booths lined the brick streets with jars of honey, pies that shimmered with glaze, and quilts bright as summer maps. A small band played an old tune, and children chased each other between hay bales while their parents judged ribbons and produce. At the center stood the Harper Pen, built stout and high, where the pride of their farm drew a circle of admirers. A hulking 500-pound hog, broad as a barrel, thick-necked and calm, a monument to the family's wealth and skill. Folks called it a marvel. They stared, whistled, and traded guesses about its weight the way others might guess the height of a grain silo. For the Harpers, this animal was proof of resources, proof of mastery, proof that their name meant success. Cal Harper soaked it in. He moved like a ringmaster, shoulder to shoulder with curious townspeople, answering easy questions and laughing louder than anyone. The grin on his face said the day already belonged to him. When his gaze found Eli Dawson near the fence, thin, quiet, hands tucked in his pockets, Cal's smile sharpened into opportunity. He tipped his chin and called out, voice rising above the band, "Hey, skeleton, think you could even nudge this beauty an inch?" The words sailed over the square and landed like a dare. Heads turned. The band faltered. A murmur ran through the crowd, quick and eager. Laughter followed, short, nervous at first, then confident, the kind that feeds on safety and numbers. People knew the math. 500 pounds was not just heavy, it was a border between ordinary and absurd. Most could not budge half of that, not with a back brace and a prayer. The thought of Eli, narrow-shouldered, quiet as a winter field, pushing that mass even a finger's breadth felt like something the wind itself would refuse. Cal stepped closer to the pen as if to give the spectacle a stage. "Go on," he said, spreading his arms to draw the town's eyes. "Give it a tap. Show us what you've got." A few men chuckled outright. Someone repeated the nickname under his breath as if saying it made the scene more certain. Yet not everyone was amused. A pair of older neighbors who had seen Eli fix a gate at dusk watched with tightened jaws. They knew more than they said, but this was the square, and the square had its own rules. Tests like this were not about truth, they were about theater. Eli stood still while the noise folded around him. He felt the grit of the bricks through the soles of his boots and the warm push of the afternoon breeze. The animal snorted softly, untroubled by the crowd, and blinked with mild curiosity. Eli's eyes flicked once to the far side of the square, to the bench in the shade where Lily sat with a blanket over her knees, a neighbor by her side. She was watching him, not with worry, but with that quiet faith that always steadied his breath. Cal noticed the glance and lifted his voice again, turning performance into pressure. "Come on, Riverstone, place your bets. Does the wind move him first, or does our featherweight?" Laughter rolled larger now, emboldened by the safety of numbers and the pageantry of a public dare. Eli did not answer. He rarely did. But inside, where he kept the reasons that guided each careful step, a cord drew tight. He was not thinking about victory or applause. He was thinking about dignity, measured in inches, about how a man chooses to stand when a town tries to make him small. The square shimmered with heat and expectation. Cal leaned on the fence, enjoying the spectacle he had lit like a match. He did not want proof of strength, he wanted proof of weakness. The crowd wanted a story they already believed. In that charged pause, with the fair at its brightest, the band quiet, and the whole town leaning forward, Eli took one small breath, and the day began to tilt. Eli stood at the edge of the square, his gaze shifting between the roaring crowd and the quiet figure of his sister. Lily had been brought to the fair in her chair by a kind neighbor, her blanket tucked carefully around her legs, her hair brushed neatly as though this day might give her a piece of the life she had once known. But she did not look at the ribbons, the pies, or the animals. She stared at the ground, shoulders drawn inward as if trying to shrink from the laughter that rolled like thunder across the square. Every jeer that struck Eli struck her twice as hard, and he saw it in the way her chin trembled. For years he had taken the blows alone, building walls of silence to protect her from knowing too much of what the town thought of him. Yet here in the bright center of the fair, there was no hiding. She was watching it all, and the wound in her eyes cut deeper than any insult. Something broke open inside him, something that had long pressed against the edges of his endurance. It was not fury wild and reckless. It was a steady surge, a weight that rose from years of swallowing words, years of keeping his hands at his sides while men like Cal Harper laughed. He had always told himself it did not matter what the town thought, so long as Lily was safe, so long as she had someone to lean on. But in that moment he understood that her pain was bound to his, that every time he lowered his head, she lowered hers too. The air between them filled with an invisible thread, her silence asking for something she could not say, his silence answering what he could no longer deny. For the first time in his life, Eli stepped forward not as a shadow slipping through laughter, but as a man choosing to stand in the center of it. The crowd shifted, some leaning closer, others drawing back, as if sensing a shift in the air. Cal, broad and confident, still leaned on the hog pen with the smirk of someone sure the outcome was already written. But when Eli lifted his head, his eyes fixed on Cal's, and his voice carried over the square with a clarity that hushed the noise. "What if I carry it?" The words did not shout, but they struck like a bell rung in the still of night. The laughter cracked, faltered, and fell silent. People blinked, uncertain if they had heard correctly. Eli Dawson, the man who had been the town's favorite jest, was standing tall and asking for the impossible. Even Cal, so quick with his tongue, paused. His grin wavered, caught off guard by the audacity of the question. The pause stretched long enough for everyone to feel it. An awkward crack in the order of things, a tremor beneath the ground they thought was steady. Then Cal found his smirk again, slower now, edged with the kind of cruelty that hides surprise. He straightened, puffing out his chest, and raised his voice so the entire square could hear. "If you can lift this hog and carry it for a mile," he said, drawing out the words, "then I'll never bother you again." He looked around at the crowd, making sure every farmer, every neighbor, every whispering onlooker heard the terms. "A full mile, not one step less. You manage that, Eli, and you'll have my word." The crowd stirred. Some chuckled nervously, others murmured at the absurdity. A mile was not a dare, it was a sentence. To carry 500 pounds even a few feet was madness. To imagine Eli Dawson, the thin drifter they mocked as windblown, marching a mile with that mass on his back was beyond belief. But the silence after Cal's words was different now. It was not the laughter of certainty. It was a silence of waiting, of wondering whether they were about to see a man collapse, or a man reveal something they had all overlooked. Eli did not flinch. He looked once more at Lily, saw her eyes lift from the ground for the first time that day, wide with both fear and hope, and he gave the smallest nod, as though the challenge had already been accepted before it was spoken. The square held its breath. The balance of the day, of years of mockery and silence, now rested on what he would do next. The hog loomed inside the pen like a mountain of flesh and bone, its bulk pressing against the wooden rails as if the enclosure itself strained to contain it. 500 pounds of living weight, a creature bred to embody abundance and pride, and now the centerpiece of a dare that had silenced the town. Eli stepped closer, the dust crunching under his worn boots, and placed his hands on the animal. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. Then came the effort. His fingers dug into the rough hide, his arms trembling as they wrapped around the impossible mass. His body bent low, shoulders sinking, and the tendons in his neck pulled tight as though straining against iron chains. The color drained from his face, and sweat rose instantly at his brow. A murmur ran through the crowd, sharp and cutting, and then laughter returned like a storm breaking through. "He's about to fold in half," one voice called. Others joined, certain that this was the moment Eli would collapse under the absurdity of his own challenge. But something unexpected happened. The tremor in his arms steadied, his knees locked, and with a guttural exhale he began to rise. Inch by inch, as if pushing against the weight of the earth itself, Eli straightened. The hog squealed in protest, its massive body shifting, but the unbelievable truth unfolded before the town's eyes. The thin drifter had lifted it clear from the ground. His frame, mocked for its fragility, now bore a weight most would not dare to test. The laughter faltered, splintered, then died altogether as realization spread through the square. Eli Dawson was standing, the hog balanced across his back and shoulders. His legs quivered under the pressure, every muscle taut as bowstrings stretched to their limit. But he did not falter. He set his jaw, fixed his eyes forward, and took the first step. Dust rose around his boots. It was only a single pace, small and halting, but it was a step no one believed possible. The crowd gasped, their disbelief louder than their earlier jeers. For the first time that day, Riverstone was not laughing. It was watching. Across the square, on the bench shaded by the courthouse wall, Lily pressed her hands to the blanket over her knees, her breath caught, her eyes wide, her body leaning forward as if she could somehow carry part of the weight with him. For years she had seen her brother return home with lowered shoulders, seen him wipe his face in silence after the town treated him as less than a man. She had borne her own sorrow quietly, thinking his silence meant defeat. But now, as Eli's thin frame pushed forward step by step, something lit within her. It was not just surprise, it was a spark of belief, bright and trembling, that maybe her brother was far more than anyone had ever dared to imagine. Eli moved slowly, his knees bending, his back straining under the animal's bulk, but his focus was unbroken. He was not listening to the crowd anymore, not seeing the wide eyes or the open mouths. He carried only the image of Lily, her face transformed from resignation into hope, and that alone was worth the pain clawing through his body. Every inch he gained was more than a physical act. It was proof that dignity could be reclaimed, that silence could be broken without words. It was the beginning of a story no one in Riverstone would ever forget. Each step was like fire pressed into Eli's spine. The weight of the hog forced every muscle in his thin frame to scream with effort. His shoulders bowed beneath a burden no one believed could be carried. His breath came ragged, sharp against the heavy air of the fairground. Sweat ran in streams down his temples, blurring his vision until the faces in the crowd merged into a haze of shifting color. Yet the sound remained clear, shouts rising and colliding around him, a storm of voices, some taunted with cruel delight, eager to see him falter. He's about to drop. It's too much. Others, perhaps sensing the enormity of what was unfolding, called out encouragement, their voices trembling with an energy they could not explain. Come on, Eli. One more step. The square had divided, half waiting for his collapse, half praying for his endurance, and Eli bore all of it on his back along with the living weight of the hog. Behind the fence, Cal Harper stood with arms crossed and a smirk twisted into something sharper. He had set the terms with confidence, convinced that humiliation would seal Eli's fate once and for all. Now his jaw clenched tighter with every pace Eli managed to take. He was unwilling to admit it, but a sliver of unease crept into his expression. For the first time, the balance of power in the square wavered. It was not Cal's laughter that filled the air, but the sound of hundreds holding their breath between disbelief and awe. Still, he told himself it was only a matter of time. The boy would break. He had to. At the halfway mark of the mile, Eli's steps faltered. His knee buckled, his shoulder dipped, and the hog shifted dangerously against his back. A wave of gasps swept through the crowd as the animal let out a guttural cry that cut through the noise. For a terrifying instant it seemed certain that Eli would fall, that the dare would end in collapse and the laughter would return sharper than ever. The air seemed to freeze in that moment, every eye locked on the thin figure swaying under the impossible weight. Children clutched their parents' hands. The band, long silent, watched with instruments lowered. All of Riverstone teetered on the edge of the single step. Eli dropped to one knee, the dust clouding around him, and for a heartbeat the silence deepened, thick with expectation of defeat. His arms trembled violently, his vision swam, and his lungs burned as if there were no air left in the world. He could hear the mutters already rising, could almost feel Cal's grin sharpening in triumph. But then, through the blur and the noise, his gaze found the small figure at the edge of the crowd. Lily, sitting in her chair, her hands clutching the blanket across her knees, her lips parted in a silent plea. She was not laughing, not doubting, not jeering. She was simply watching with wide eyes, waiting to see if her brother could stand. And in that instant, Eli's world narrowed to her alone. The crowd disappeared. The pain became distant, and all that remained was the bond between them. Through clenched teeth, in a voice meant for no one else, he whispered, "For you, Lily." The words barely left his mouth, but they carried enough strength to ignite his body again. With a groan that shook through his frame, he forced one foot forward, then the other, rising inch by inch until he was standing once more. The hog shifted but held, and Eli straightened his back with the stubborn fire of a man who refused to surrender. The crowd erupted, not in laughter this time, but in a chorus of awe, disbelief, and sudden hope. Even those who had doubted could not deny what they were seeing. A thin drifter mocked as weak had bent, but not broken. He had fallen to the edge of collapse, yet he had risen again, not for pride, not for the crowd, but for the quiet strength of the sister who gave him reason. It was not triumph yet, but it was the spark of it, burning brighter with every step he now forced forward. And for the first time, Cal Harper's smirk faded into silence. The years of humiliation pressed against Eli's mind with every step he took. The weight on his shoulders was not just the hog. It was the memories of every laugh, every shove, every time he had been brushed aside like a shadow too thin to matter. As his legs pushed forward and his body screamed with pain, his mind replayed the long parade of indignities that had shaped him. He saw the nights at the bar when mugs tipped over his lap, the afternoons when children hurled names across the dusty road, the mornings when grown men whispered and grinned as he passed. They had called him weak, a man without backbone, a soul unfit to stand among them. All of it had been endured in silence, a silence he wore like armor to protect the one person who depended on him. But now, beneath the burning sun and before the entire town, that silence cracked open. What rushed out was not fear, not shame, but a rage sharpened by years of restraint. It was not the blind rage of someone who lashes out. It was the steady fire of a man who has been pushed too far for too long. With every trembling pace, the fire grew. His feet struck the dirt with the rhythm of defiance, as if each step shouted back at the jeers that had haunted him. His arms trembled beneath the hog's bulk, but his eyes no longer wavered. They were fixed straight ahead, unyielding, as though daring the world itself to try and break him again. Every stagger forward was not just a movement of muscle, but a declaration. I am not what you said I was. The crowd began to change. At first there had been laughter, casual and cruel, fed by the certainty that he would crumble. But as the minutes stretched and Eli refused to fall, the sound shifted. One by one, voices fell silent, leaving only the scrape of boots as people followed him along the road. The air grew taut with something unfamiliar, respect, reluctant and hushed, growing stronger with every step he managed to steal from defeat. What had begun as a mockery was turning into something none of them expected to witness. Men who had joined Cal Harper in mocking Eli now watched with their mouths closed, shame pricking at their pride. Women who had once shaken their heads at the thin boy trudging past their porches now clutched their aprons and whispered prayers under their breath. Even the children who had parroted their parents' cruelty stood wide-eyed, struck silent by the sight of a man they thought powerless, carrying a burden so impossible it seemed carved out of myth. And in the midst of this silence, only one sound remained clear, the ragged, heavy breath of Eli Dawson. It filled the square, filled the ears of those who had come to watch him fail. Each exhale was a drumbeat, a rhythm of defiance. He was not carrying just the hog. He was carrying every scar, every moment of shame, every wound the town had inflicted on him, and he bore them now for all to see. His back bent, but his spirit towered. In that moment, Riverstone understood something it had never considered. The man they thought fragile had always been stronger than them all, because he had endured their cruelty without breaking. And now he was turning that endurance into fire. The hush that spread over the crowd was more powerful than any cheer. It was the kind of silence born not from indifference but from awe, the silence of a town realizing that the story they had written about Eli Dawson was wrong. And in that silence, the only proof they needed came in the sound of his breath, and the sight of his thin frame forcing itself forward step by grueling step against a weight that symbolized not just the hog, but the sum of his life's battles. The road stretched long beneath Eli's boots, each step carved out of pain and resolve. But at last the milestone came into sight. Dust clung to his sweat-soaked shirt, his breath tore from his lungs in heavy bursts, and still the great weight pressed down on his narrow shoulders. Yet somehow, impossibly, he endured. When his foot crossed the chalk line scratched into the dirt by the townsfolk, the line that marked 1 full mile, the square erupted with a roar that shook the air. Cheers rose like a wave cresting over silence, crashing down with a force that startled even those who cried it out. For a moment the town forgot itself, the divisions, the whispers, the laughter that had once defined Eli Dawson. All that remained was awe, disbelief turned to thunderous approval. Eli slowed, his knees trembling as he steadied the animal across his back one last time. With a deliberate breath, he bent low, easing the massive hog onto the ground with care, as though even this act should be done with dignity. Dust swirled around them as the creature landed on sturdy legs and gave a grunt, unconcerned with the storm of history it had just been part of. Eli straightened slowly, his spine unfolding until he stood tall, far taller in that moment than his frame suggested. His chest heaved, but his eyes lifted steady, searching for the only face that mattered in the sea of astonished townsfolk. The crowd could not contain itself. Farmers who had once scoffed slapped their knees and shouted. Young men who had laughed the loudest now clapped until their hands burned. Even the elders, men who rarely gave praise to anyone outside their own kin, raised their palms in applause, their lined faces softened by respect. Riverstone had witnessed something beyond strength. It had witnessed endurance that no jeer could crush. For the first time in memory, the name Eli Dawson carried weight heavier than mockery. At the edge of the square, Cal Harper stood frozen. His face had lost its color, his jaw locked in disbelief. The smirk that had defined his place in every crowd was gone, replaced by the pale stillness of a man who had wagered everything on another's failure and lost. His fists tightened until the knuckles whitened, but no words came. What could he say when his power had crumbled before the very people he sought to impress? His defeat was not in the silence of his own mouth, but in the roar of the town that no longer looked to him as the measure of strength. In that moment, Cal Harper was small, and Eli Dawson was undeniable. Through the din, Eli's gaze found Lily. She was no longer staring at the ground, no longer shielding herself from the cruelty of voices around her. Tears streaked down her face, but they were not the tears of sorrow she had carried for years. They were tears of pride, unrestrained and shining, spilling from eyes that had finally seen the truth revealed for all. Her lips trembled with words she could not say above the crowd's cries, but Eli read them all the same. Her brother, once diminished by the town, now stood as her hero in plain sight. He did not raise his fists in triumph or shout to claim the moment. He simply straightened his back, weary yet unbroken, and held Lily's gaze. In the connection between them, stronger than any applause, lived the victory he had fought for. Not the defeat of Cal Harper, not the astonishment of Riverstone, but the quiet transformation of his sister's belief. That was the triumph no one could take from him. And as the fair carried on around them, Eli Dawson stood as more than the thin drifter. He stood as proof that dignity, carried far enough, could outlast even the heaviest weight. When the cheers finally ebbed, A hush swept across the square, deeper and more profound than any noise before it. It was not the silence of mockery or boredom. It was the silence of realization. The same men and women who had once turned Eli Dawson into a living jest now found themselves staring at him with wide eyes and a respect they had never thought to give. Dust hung in the air, catching the late sun, as though the square itself held its breath, unwilling to break the moment. Eli stood in the center, his shirt clinging with sweat, his shoulders stooped with exhaustion, yet lifted by something far greater. He had carried the impossible, and in doing so he had carried himself into a place no ridicule could reach. The crowd parted slowly as an older farmer stepped forward. He was a man whose back was bent from decades of labor in the fields, his hands marked with the kind of scars that spoke of years spent fighting earth and weather. His voice was rough, worn with age, but it carried weight in the square. He looked Eli in the eyes, steady and honest, and said, "You're the strongest man in this town, son, but your strength isn't in muscle." His words settled over the crowd like a blanket, simple yet undeniable, and they struck deeper than any cheer. For this man had seen what true labor cost, and he recognized something in Eli that went beyond the body. Around them, heads nodded. Murmurs rose not in disbelief but in agreement. The people of Riverstone, who for so long had chosen laughter over compassion, now shifted in their stance. Faces that had once curled with smirks now softened, some even with shame. They had mistaken silence for weakness, humility for emptiness, and in their mistake they had overlooked the quiet fire that had burned in Eli all along. It was only now, after he had carried a weight that no one else dared attempt, that they could see it clearly. He had not been weak. He had been stronger than them all because he bore the unseen burdens with dignity. Lily, still seated at the edge of the square, covered her mouth with trembling hands, her eyes shining through tears of joy. The pride that radiated from her seemed to lift Eli higher than any applause. For her, the moment was not about the town's change of heart. It was about the brother who had endured for her sake, the man who had never faltered when she needed him. Her gaze alone was worth more than the roar of 100 voices, but now at last the entire town echoed what she had always known. Eli did not boast or raise his hands to the sky. He did not meet the praise with arrogance. He simply stood, weary but unbroken, his chest rising and falling as he absorbed the shift in the air. For years he had been the target of whispers and taunts, a story told at others' expense. Now he was no longer the boy they had dismissed. He had become a symbol, not of physical might, but of endurance, sacrifice, and willpower that no insult could erode. The square remained still, the townsfolk bound together in the rare unity of shared respect. In the quiet, Eli Dawson ceased to be the thin drifter. He became something greater, a reminder to all who had doubted that true strength is not measured by the size of one's body, but by the size of one's spirit. From that day forward, the people of Riverstone would remember this moment whenever they looked at him, and whenever they spoke his name, it would no longer be with laughter but with reverence. Dot. The morning after the fair, Riverstone carried a different kind of quiet. The square, where laughter and jeers had once echoed, now held only the whispers of retold words and wide-eyed recollections. Cal Harper left before the sun climbed high, his broad shoulders hunched, his boots striking the ground without their usual swagger. The weight of humiliation pressed heavier than any hog his family had ever raised. For years, Cal had ruled the town's gatherings with his voice and his fists, but that power had slipped away in a single mile walked by the man he had mocked most. He spoke to no one, offered no farewell, and those who watched him go did not call after him. They only exchanged glances, aware that the balance had shifted forever. In contrast, Eli Dawson's name now rolled across the county like a spark carried on wind. Farmers told their families of the sight they had witnessed. Merchants repeated it to travelers who passed through, and by the time night returned, the story had already stretched beyond Riverstone's borders. People spoke of the thin man who lifted the impossible, who walked a mile with half a ton pressing down, not for glory but for something far greater. They repeated his name with a mixture of disbelief and pride, as though to say they had lived in the same town as a man who carried not just an animal, but the weight of dignity itself. Yet for Eli, the noise outside mattered little. He did not walk home thinking of applause, nor did he dream of how his story would spread. What lived in his heart was far quieter, far more profound. At the edge of the square, beneath the fading light of the fair, he had looked at Lily and seen her tears glisten, not with pain, but with pride. For the first time in years, her eyes had not been lowered in shame or sorrow. She had lifted her head, seen her brother not as a man worn down by the world, but as someone who had risen above it. That look was the only victory Eli ever sought, and in it he found a peace no cheer could surpass. He had proven something the town had never cared to see, that strength is not measured in the thickness of arms or the size of shoulders. True strength comes from what you are willing to carry, from the sacrifices you are willing to make, from the love that drives you forward when your body begs to stop. Eli had borne years of ridicule without striking back, and in that endurance lay a power far greater than muscle. By carrying the hog, he had shown them what his silence had always hidden, that the human spirit, when guided by purpose, can lift more than any man believes possible. As the days passed, the story settled into legend. Parents told their children how the thin drifter who had been the town's shadow revealed himself to be a figure of iron will. The image of Eli walking that mile, dust rising at his heels, became more than a memory. It became a lesson. Riverstone, once guilty of cruelty, now carried his example as a reminder that judgment can blind, and that greatness often hides in the places least expected. Eli Dawson did not ask to be remembered, but Riverstone remembered him all the same. His path from scorn to respect became part of the town's history, a tale carried on porches, retold in barns, passed across generations. And though the world might forget the details of the fair or the ribbons awarded that day, no one in Riverstone ever forgot the thin drifter who lifted the impossible, and in doing so, lifted an entire town's understanding of what true strength meant.